more than a quarter of a century, she was the undisputed queen of the skies.
If you really love flying, then Concorde was the airliner for you.
The most advanced commercial jet ever.
A work of art, absolute work of art.
Costing more than £3 billion to develop. Taking 15 years to build. And flying faster than any airliner before or since.
Twice the speed of sound, 10% faster than a rifle bullet.
This is the extraordinary story of an extraordinary machine. Told by the makers.
Everybody thought it was a bloody good aircraft. And it's quite an experience just to look at it.
The pilots.
It was just a magical experience because you go to places that other people can't, up at 60,000 feet.
And the passengers.
You're drinking the best champagne, you're having the best food. The service is better than first class. It's Concorde class.
From its triumphant launch to its tragic demise.
Time to say goodbye, and they came in their thousands to do so.
This was the plane that defied the odds and defined the golden age of supersonic travel.
She was streets ahead of anything else. And quite honestly, the rest of the aviation world is just starting to catch up now.
"14 years after Concorde completed its last supersonic flight, 17 of the 20 models remain. Museum pieces dotted around the globe. For most of her active life, she catered for the privileged few, wealthy and famous passengers paying up to £6,000 to travel between London and New York in just 3.5 hours.
It's always exciting flying supersonic, and it's always exciting to get to New York before you've left.
Yet for many, it was the people's plane. They'd paid for it, lived through its turbulent years, then seen it become the world's most famous aircraft and undoubtedly the most beautiful.
People would stop and look up as Concorde went over. And everybody in the UK felt an element of ownership of the aeroplane, and it was their Concorde.
The shape, I think it's magnificent. It just appears to be right. It's what dreams can be made of, and indeed what dreams were made of.
The dream began amidst the wreckage of post-war Britain. In 1945, much of the country's industrial heartlands were in ruins. But the war had also provided a major boost to one sector of the economy. The 6 years of fighting had forced through an advancement in military aircraft. And as peace dawned, old propeller planes like the Spitfire were being phased out. In their place, jet fighters, like the Gloucester Meteor. With its experience and unrivaled expertise, the UK was poised to become the global leader in civil aviation.
Two of the things that the Brits were world beaters at immediately after the war were aircraft manufacture in terms of airframe and engine manufacture. We were the best country in the world. And so we were playing to our strength. If we could develop and produce something that nobody else could do, then that would be a big financial benefit for the UK.
By 1949, it looked like the country was on course. In July that year, a prototype for the world's first commercial jetliner rolled off the production lines of the de Havilland factory in Hertfordshire. The DC-106, or Comet as she was known, could cruise at 500 miles an hour and carry 80 passengers with the promise of vibration-free flight. Orders poured in from around the world. But within just 5 years, this pioneering plane would become a relic.
This is the tragic scene of the Comet disaster near Calcutta. Wreckage of the aircraft smashed almost beyond recognition.
After 3 fatal crashes, the entire Comet fleet was grounded in 1954. testing revealed metal fatigue had caused the aircraft to break up while in the air. Following the war, Britain was said to be 10 years ahead of the US when it came to aviation. But now, its reputation was in tatters, and the Americans were set to overtake.
Boeing had arrived with the 707. The 707 trounced the Comet. It took over international air travel, particularly across the Atlantic. It was reliable, it was safe. The Yanks had come.
Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard the spacious cabin, attractively decorated, air-conditioned but draft-free.
As the Americans' share of plane design and manufacturing grew, Britain knew its own industry was at a crossroads. In 1956, ministers called the leaders of the aviation sector to a crisis meeting and laid down a challenge.
The British wanted to get ahead once more. They knew they needed to do something really rather spectacular. The obvious answer was, it's time to go supersonic.
But developing commercial planes that could break the sound barrier was easier said than done. At that point, just a handful of the world's most advanced military jets had managed to do so. The American pilot Chuck Yeager, in his Bell X-1, had been the first to fly supersonic in October 1947.
Through the sound barrier, the first time ever in level flight.
The sound barrier, also known as Mach 1, is an actual physical barrier. Aircraft noise creates sound waves that then spread out. As the plane approaches the speed of sound, those waves build up on the front of the plane, which then needs massive power to go through them. When it does, it emits a deafening shockwave known as a sonic boom.
If a plane is to go through the sound barrier, one of the most crucial features is the wing design. There are two designs you can use. The first is a really thin one, like on the Bell X-1 rocket plane. Now, while that's fine on a military jet, it wouldn't be strong enough to carry the weight of an airliner. So instead, you need something called a delta wing. Now, deltas are really clever because they sweep away all the pressures on the wing away from the aircraft. This is vital because if a conventional wing tried to break through the sound barrier, its wings would just snap off.
In 1956, the British government invited submissions for its new supersonic airliner. Among the 400 who bid for the contract was Barnes Wallis. The designer of the bouncing bomb used by the RAF dam busters had a different idea for the wings.
There is another solution, and that is to design, if you can, an aircraft which is capable of changing its shape whilst in flight.
But it was another team from the British Aircraft Corporation at Filton in Bristol whose designs were most impressive. One of its key members was Ted Talbot, a brilliant young aerodynamics expert.
Dr. Ted Talbot was one of the legends, and thank God people this clever were available for the Concorde's development. But what a humble guy as well, and his diagram survived to this day.
We had the Ministry asking us to look into supersonic transport. And you got different shapes of aircraft. Some of them were hideous. You looked at them, you thought that won't work.
Today, Ted Talbot is in his 90s and still living near Bristol.
What you're looking at is our submission for an aircraft that will fly at 1.2 Mach number. But you see, we're now getting towards the Concorde one.
His original diagrams include a plane that could travel at Mach 2.2, twice the speed of sound. It was known as design number 223.
We then submitted this to the ministry, and they chose us to do the job.
The contract was awarded in 1961. The UK was now committed to its audacious supersonic passenger travel project. But it would potentially cost billions. And if it was to get off the ground, a near-bankrupt government would have to turn to its wartime allies for help. Concorde. The aircraft that's instantly recognizable the world over took 16 years from concept to completion. During that time, it faced political obstacles and design hurdles. But in post-war Britain, the first and greatest challenge was financial.
Britain certainly needed a partner with Concorde. It was just simply too expensive a project from the word go. When Concorde was first being discussed seriously in 1956, you have to remember that Britain had only stopped issuing ration books to its population 2 years earlier. This was quite a different world, and remember, it was a Britain that, although technologically advanced, was basically bankrupt.
Britain turned to the US for help, but it was too late. The Americans had already started developing their own supersonic plane. If successful, it would carry up to 300 passengers and cruise at 3 times the speed of sound. For Washington, it would be a spectacular statement of American power.
This was at the height of the Cold War. America had to do everything better, it had to do it faster, and it had to do it alone to show its strength against the Soviet Union.
With America out, Britain looked to Europe and the one country able to take on such a project. France had been developing its own supersonic plans, but on November the 29th, 1962, it agreed to merge them with Britain's.
The British and the French aviation industries both knew that they were capable of building a supersonic airliner. In fact, both had projects running side by side. And because there's only one elegant answer to such a complex problem, they were coming up with very, very similar designs, which is why the two nations came together.
As well as sharing the costs, the two countries agreed to divide any profits equally. They also established a no-break clause, meaning heavy penalties if either country backed out. Soon, the project was employing more than 200,000 people, the largest joint country enterprise the world had ever seen. The British were based in Bristol and the French at Toulouse. There was cooperation and respect between the two groups of engineers, but also rivalry.
The weights engineer spoke French, and so in the evenings he'd run these French classes for us, and I spoke quite a bit, but I never used it, because in the meetings you could listen to them and know what was going on when they thought you didn't understand what you're doing.
Tensions also surfaced between the two governments over the plane's name.
The name Concorde, which is an absolutely brilliant name, it means alliance, peace. It was a peaceful alliance between the French and the English. It was a terrific name, but there was a very funny thing about it, is that the British government and the civil service, notably the Ministry of Aviation, insisted on English spelling. So it'd be Concorde, C-O-N-C-O-R-D. But the French called it Concorde, of course, with an E on the end. And there became this extraordinary, silly, idiotic battle.
For a while, Britain resisted the French spelling. But then the Labour MP, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, offered a compromise.
The hero of the hour was Tony Benn. The young Minister of Technology stepped in and said, of course it must be called Concorde with an E. And he said, anyway, E stands for elegance, excellence, Englishness. And he understood the imperative of Britain taking a gamble, a leap into the future.
Back on the factory floor, the British and French engineers had a more pressing problem. Their new plane was to be powered by 4 Olympus jet engines. These would provide 36,000 pounds of thrust, enough to reach Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. But the engines weren't designed to take in supersonic air. In fact, reaching such an incredible speed would destroy them.
The problem was beautifully new and beautifully difficult. The aircraft was hitting the air at 1,350 miles an hour. The engine would only take it at 350 miles an hour. So you got to knock off 1,000 miles an hour in the distance between the leading edge of the wing and the engine itself.
Devising a new so-called air intake system would prove to be the project's biggest engineering task. To work, it had to slow down the air for the engine without slowing the plane.
The idea is to actually squeeze the air down and slow it. This is the intake, and as you can see, we've got ramp door, and inside is a smaller door, and the two together actually squeeze the supersonic air that's coming in to make it slow down, and the engine can take that in quite happily. And all this happens in 14 feet of intake.
But the Bristol engineers did more than just slow the air down as it hit the engine. Once it was inside, they harnessed the air pressure to make the plane go faster.
The air intake system produced roughly 68% of your thrust. It sounds weird, doesn't it? A box, because that's all it is, a big box, doesn't burn fuel itself, but that produces the bulk of your thrust. A work of art, absolute work of art.
The breakthrough meant Concorde could travel at twice the speed of sound without having to use its afterburners and using much less fuel than during takeoff. This was called super cruising. In the whole of aviation history, only Concorde has achieved it, and it was largely down to one man.
Dr. Ted Talbot, to me, he is the father of the Concorde intake. He headed the development team. The man's a genius. It's as simple as that. He is a genius.
By 1966, Britain's economy was booming, with millions of families buying their first cars, kitchen appliances, and televisions. As the assembly of Concorde finally got underway, it seemed to underline the country's newfound wealth and confidence.
The French are building one prototype of Concorde, we're building the other. This is the first interchange of parts between the two countries.
The old British Aircraft Corporation, which became British Aerospace, employed tens and tens of thousands. Anytime I was there during the day, you were just aware of this mass of people, like a load of ants. And there was these big green airplane-type shapes surrounded by scaffolding. And it was great seeing them transformed from essentially inanimate green metallic chunks into most beautiful, beautiful aircraft. It was a little bit like a chrysalis, seeing the evolution of it.
2 prototypes were being built simultaneously on both sides of the channel. But the Toulouse project had managed to get slightly ahead. And so, on the 14th of December 1967, it was France that introduced Concorde to the world.
At Toulouse, the French-built prototype is officially unveiled after 5 years of hard work and meticulous cooperation. 5 years of entente concordiale between French and British designers and engineers to create a new generation of passenger aircraft.
On the newsreels, in people's homes, on the black and white tellers, this aircraft, it just looked like the future, and it thrilled people. I don't think one can exaggerate that.
Concorde's distinctive design and staggering speed capability caught the public's imagination from the off.
There's a whole host of reasons why Concorde always attracted so much public interest. I mean, It is capable of doing amazing things, twice the speed of sound, 1,350 miles an hour. So that attracts people's attention. But so beautifully shaped. And the psychologists would say that she appealed to us because she appealed to both sides of the brain. She appealed to the scientific side and the artistic side. She looks like every child's paper dart.
As the British and French progressed with their supersonic project, the aerospace giant Boeing was leading the US effort.
The ambitions of the American supersonic program were extraordinary, and they were completely impossible to achieve.
Went to a much higher Mach number, about 2.7. You know, they had to be faster, and they had to be bigger. And putting those two things together gave them a most peculiar type of aircraft.
If the American plane was to fly faster than Concorde, it would require an even sleeker wing. But for landing and takeoff, the wings had to swing out on a hinge to provide more lift.
Boeing's got themselves into terrible trouble with this because the whole thing was so heavy, and it was part of the reason the project died.
If you throw enough money at anything, you can usually sort it out. Unless you're Americans, then you don't get a supersonic transport.
The USA program continued until the end of the decade, costing $1.6 billion. But the closest it ever got to a supersonic airliner was this wooden model. Instead, the country chose a completely different course for its aviation future.
When America realized that it had lost the supersonic race, they moved from supersonic to supersized. They invented the jumbo, they invented the 747, an extraordinarily large aircraft that could take passengers from A to B far cheaper than anything they had ever flown before.
But while the Americans had given up on smashing the sound barrier commercially, the Russians hadn't. And when they joined the supersonic race, their design was familiar. The Tu-144 was the brainchild of Soviet aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev. It was so similar to its British rival, the press suspected industrial espionage. Some papers even dubbed it Concordski.
I will never ever call the Tu-144 Concordski because you cannot mention this wonderful airplane Concorde and this diabolical concoction that the Russians came out with in the same breath. It was like looking inside of a green Meccano set, as I seem to remember. Huge, great big dials. She was a very crude airplane.
She may have been crude, but her development was fast. On the 31st of December 1968, the Tu-144 beat the West and took to the air first.
The Tupolev's first flight has literally put the Concorde's nose out of joint.
Although the plane was politically important for the Russians, it was never meant to compete with Concorde commercially. There was no market for exclusive travel in the communist Soviet Union. And technically, the plane lagged far behind.
The thing wouldn't make the Atlantic. The noise level in the cabins was diabolical. And the most important thing, the aircraft couldn't supercruise. Now, supercruise means flying at twice the speed of sound without afterburning. To this day, there's only one aircraft in history that would fly at Mach 2 and supercruise without using any afterburning reheat. That's Concorde.
Just 2 months after the Tupolev's maiden flight, it was Concorde's turn to take to the skies. On the 2nd of March 1969, Chief Test Pilot Andrei Turka took the controls of the world's fastest airliner.
At last, it's okay for takeoff. Take her away, Turka. She's all yours.
As Concorde sped down the Toulouse runway at 235 miles per hour, the world was watching. For the design and engineering teams, a decade of work was about to be put on public trial.
Now, up toward the skies, the white bird of tomorrow.
When you've done a thing like that, it's all quite surprised that the whole thing works, you know, all those systems and everything all coming together and doing what they should do. And you think, by God, that's worked, you know. It's quite an experience just to look at it.
Finally airborne, Concorde would spend the next 4 years in a tit-for-tat battle for records against its only supersonic rival, the Tupolev Tu-144. A battle in which the Soviet Union would end up paying the ultimate price. Although Concorde first took to the skies in 1969, it had to undergo years more testing before entering passenger service. And during those years, it was in a constant battle with its Russian rival, the Tu-144. As well as being first to fly supersonic, it had beaten Concorde in the race to travel at twice the speed of sound. At the Paris Air Show in 1973, the two superplanes were due to fly together for the first time.
Now, superficially, you might say, oh look, they're two identical aircraft. They were nothing like identical aircraft. What you're looking at on the Anglo-French side is one of the most supremely advanced aircraft ever built. What you're looking at on the Soviet side is an aircraft forced very quickly through a production process to meet the desires of Soviet politicians that it was actually quite unsafe. And at the air show, the pilots, of course, wanted to show off to each other.
Concorde took off first, delighting the crowds with a series of graceful and daring maneuvers. Shortly afterwards, it was the Russians' turn.
I think it's impossible to imagine the pressure the pilot was under because he was carrying the weight of the heroic workers' paradise, the Soviet Union, on his shoulders. He had the KGB looking at him. Can you imagine that? It's terrifying. And I think the pressure on the day showed. He put the aircraft through a maneuver that was far too demanding for the airframe.
The Concorde is in trouble. A TV camera films it as it goes into a steep climb and tight turn. Then suddenly begins to break up and catch fire in the air. It crashes on the outskirts of Goussainville, a tiny village 18 miles from Paris, killing all 6 of the crew and 8 civilians, mostly children, and injuring 28.
The crash of the Tu-144 signaled the end of the Soviet Union's supersonic ambitions. The hastily developed plane, which had been used to carry mail around Russia, was put out of service soon afterwards. The Paris disaster had underlined the importance of testing, and no plane underwent more than Concorde.
Every single system was tested. She was tested like crazy.
Each element came under minute scrutiny, including its 25-foot nose. Although essential for the plane to fly at twice the speed of sound, this had to be lowered when coming into land to give the pilots a view of the runway. They equipped this prototype with what was to become its most distinctive feature, the variable nose, or droop snoop. After rigorous in-flight testing and feedback from pilots, the optimum angle was found to be 12.5 degrees. Next, the challenge of extreme heat. When the plane flew at supersonic speed, the friction caused by air rushing past would cause the fuselage to reach more than 100 degrees Celsius. So the panels were tested against heaters that replicated the searing temperatures.
The airplane gets incredibly hot. The maximum temperature it gets to on the front of the nose is 127 degrees centigrade, bearing in mind that the outside air temperature is minus 60. The front you can boil an egg on.
For the cockpit, the hottest part of the plane, a retractable heat shield visor was added to protect the pilots and keep the plane streamlined. As Britain and France were hoping to sell Concorde worldwide, the designers also had to make sure it would work in cold conditions.
And the idea was to fly into ice-bearing clouds to see actually how much ice would be attached to the wing. They suddenly realised that if you increase the angle of climb, so climbed quite steeply through an ice-bearing cloud, and wow, there was lots of ice on the wing. It was pretty scary.
A team took a specially fitted Concorde packed with monitoring equipment all round the globe.
Well, we'd probably go away with about 12, 15 people. That was a mix of engineers, test pilots, observers, etc. And the duration of the trials could be a week, 2 weeks.
One such trial took place in the Moroccan city, Tangier. Here they discovered that their revolutionary air intake system would have to change for every variance of temperature and altitude, as well as every speed. That would only be possible with a computer-controlled system.
They made a bold decision that they were going to have to convert from an analog to a digital control system, which is commonplace nowadays. Only problem was there was no such thing as an airborne digital control system at that time. And where I worked at Filton, there was BAC Guided Weapons Division. And they had a team up there that had developed the Rapier surface-to-air missile. And the launcher used a big digital processor. And a team was formed, and they were given 6 months to adapt this massive, massive digital computer. And we needed to have 8 of these boxes.
In the 1970s, computers were cumbersome. Even a room full of the highest spec machines was less powerful than many of today's smartphones. But the Concorde team managed to shrink the technology down to a size suitable for flight, and so gave birth to the world's first aeronautical digital control system.
Concorde used so many things in her systems that were really, truly revolutionary. And quite honestly, the rest of the aviation world is just starting to catch up now. That's how far ahead of her time she was.
With the new aircraft nearing completion, it was time for the then Minister of Aerospace, Michael Heseltine, to embark on a global sales tour using one of the prototypes.
I set off across the world, and the one that looked encouraging was Iran.
Tehran International Airport, midway between London and Tokyo. Concorde was there to show her paces to Iranian officials, and in particular, the Shah.
We were going on this flight. The Shah was going to be my guest. And whilst we were in the air, my task was to make him buy the thing. The plane took off, and within minutes, seconds, if I remember, he got up and said, "I want to go on the flight deck." And so I was sitting like a lemon at the back, having lost my fox, so to speak.
Slicing through the atmosphere at twice the speed of sound, the Shah at the controls.
I caught up with him, and we had 200 yards to the Royal Pavilion in Tehran Airport. And I said, "Your Majesty, are you going to buy?" He said, "Yes, I'll buy too."
But not everyone shared the former Iranian leader's enthusiasm. In June 1972, Concorde flew into Sydney, and a storm of protest. Campaigners feared its environmental impact and, most of all, its noise. When traveling faster than the speed of sound, a shock wave of air pressure creates a huge boom, And as the public were beginning to discover, that boom doesn't end once a plane has passed through the sound barrier.
The sonic boom does follow the aeroplane. If you could move along the ground with the aeroplane, it would just be one continuous boom. And it's a carpet that will spread for tens of miles. There was no way this aircraft could ever fly supersonically over populated areas. It's just totally unacceptable.
With Concorde unable to fly over land, its potential routes became limited, and interest from airlines started to fall away.
One after the other of the potential sales evaporated, and in the end, it was a disaster. It didn't sell any aircraft.
Concorde had 0 orders, and to make matters worse, Britain's economy was on its knees. A spike in the world oil prices had caused a recession, power cuts, and a 3-day working week. Meanwhile, the government's supersonic project continued to hemorrhage cash. After spending billions, it needed someone to take Concorde off its hands, even if it meant giving it away free. By 1976, Concorde was finally ready for commercial flight. After 16 years, the design and engineering teams had succeeded in building the world's most advanced airliner.
Everybody thought it was a bloody good aircraft to work on, and we really enjoyed the work that we did.
Against all odds, the engineers had delivered a commercial plane that was even faster than its military counterparts.
We had a call from air traffic control, and they said a Royal Air Force Tornado F3 would like to do a practice intercept. We said, we're fine, you know, we're happy to help. Okay, he's 12 miles behind you. He's 13 miles behind you. He's 15 miles behind you. Now, this tornado is on full reheat, trying to intercept Concorde. He's given up. This is an airliner.
But it was an airliner nobody wanted. The government had failed to secure orders from around the world, and even British Airways was reluctant to add it to its fleet.
Frankly, it was pretty humiliating because our national airline was not prepared to hand over any money. And I had to conduct the negotiations, which were very one-sided, and they simply said no.
Concorde's deafening sonic boom made it unsuitable for travelling over land, which severely restricted the routes on which it could fly. BA did finally agree to take it, but only if it came free and with all development costs written off.
We agreed to let them have it on the basis that if it made some money, the government would get something back. But it was a very one-sided deal. It was not my finest negotiations.
After taking delivery of their new Concorde fleets, BA and Air France coordinated their first commercial flights on January the 21st, 1976. Air France would fly Paris to Rio, while BA would go from London to Bahrain. Embarrassingly, BA's Concorde couldn't fly supersonically for most of its flight, as the route took it over mainland Europe. But both airlines were worried about the financial viability of their routes. If Concorde was to pay its way, it needed new destinations, and one in particular.
They just had to get Concorde flying to America. The range was exactly what Concorde was designed for, but most importantly, there was no one in the Atlantic Ocean who was going to be complaining about that sonic boom.
In May 1976, Air France and BA's Concordes arrived at Washington, D.C. at exactly the same time to celebrate opening the transatlantic route. But Washington wasn't where the potential passengers were. They were 230 miles up America's east coast.
One of the key necessities in Concorde's continued existence was to get the aeroplane into New York. But the Port of New York Authority absolutely refused to have it. They said it would violate all their noise restrictions, it would deafen people, it would this, it would that.
It wasn't only the sonic boom that worried New Yorkers. Concorde's narrow wings meant it had to use its full power for takeoff and landing, making it incredibly noisy. And JFK Airport was situated in a densely built-up area.
We had been comprehensively briefed on the sort of reception we were going to get from the USA press. How long will it take you to deafen our children with this wretched aeroplane of yours? That sort of attitude. It was really anti.
But along with the environmental concerns, there were also political considerations.
It wasn't an American aircraft, and therefore the Port of New York Authority caused a lot of aggro. I'd been brought up very much in the wartime ethos of a special relationship. Dealing with the Port of New York Authority showed me a rather different side of our relationship.
After a series of legal battles, ending in the Supreme Court, BA was allowed a test run to demonstrate how loud Concorde really was.
I had drawn the short straw and had to do the first ever takeoff of Concorde out of New York. And it's quite a complex maneuver. And as soon as you got airborne, you put in 25 degrees of bank, and then you gradually climb round. Complex maneuver.
Normal subsonic planes would fly out over built-up areas. But the maneuverability of Concorde allowed it to swerve quickly after takeoff, avoiding houses and noise monitors.
And we went in, we landed back, and we were told that our noise level registered on takeoff hadn't even triggered the noise monitors. And that's how ultimately we proved conclusively that we could meet their noise requirements, and we were then given permission to fly the aeroplane into New York.
25 years after the first jet passenger service lifted off, the world's most beautiful jetliner is ready for supersonic travel anywhere.
In November 1977, just a month after passing its noise test, Concorde's iconic London to New York route opened for business.
The Americans, once they had accepted that it could fly into New York, became absolutely in adulation about the aeroplane. They loved flying on it. More Americans flew on it than British people. They loved it. It did a lot of things for people, particularly when you look at the profile of people who flew on Concorde. Top businessmen, politicians, VIPs and so on. And they all were A, saving time, and B, saving condition. Because just to be in the metal tube for 4 hours rather than 8 hours to go to New York left them ready to go about their business. And many's the time that we took people out to New York on the morning flight, leaving London at 10:30, arriving at New York 9:30 in the morning. They would do a day's work and they would return on the evening Concorde.
But although it attracted the VIP set, Concorde's high running costs meant it continued to lose money. And by 1982, BA's boss warned that it had just 2 years to become profitable or face the axe. Next time, how two pilots managed to save Concorde from financial ruin.
It was seen as a white elephant. So we started saying, it's not a white elephant, it's a golden eagle. And it's going to make a profit.
And how a devastating crash marked the beginning of the end.
And the aircraft went out of service for all the wrong reasons. In my opinion, the British Airways would be making a healthy profit with Concorde to this day.